Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of chapter 2, which will focus primarily on media convergence rather than just the basic history of the internet. Media convergence, as you may remember from week 1, has two definitions. The first definition means that media kind of merge in their formats where a journalist who's working at a newspaper also needs to be able to write for digital news and for social media news as well. It's kind of the idea that everything is everywhere. The second definition of media convergence, as you may remember, is more about ownership. It's the merging of owners where there are only a few key players in media that make the majority of the media decisions. We'll be talking about both, but first let's start with that first definition where we're talking more about everything being everywhere. Convergence has been happening for a while now, but we've really seen it in the past 5 years. You can think about the convergence with every single platform, whether it be your smartphone, your computer, your tablets, even your TVs are now smart TVs with apps and the ability to connect to the internet. Smartphones and touchscreen technology has really made convergence possible. It really started with the first popular smartphone, which was the BlackBerry. If you've never heard of or seen a BlackBerry, they were actually pretty large phones that had a full keyboard that you typed into. And they were mostly known for working professionals, but became popular as they were able to connect to the internet. In 2007, Apple released their first iPhone, and I actually had an original iPhone back in the day. And the first iPad actually came out in 2010. And the interesting part about the iPad is that it was originally criticized because people said that it lacked convenience for people. They thought that it would never replace a laptop. And we've seen how the kind of integration of new technologies and things like that have really made iPads and tablets more popularized. You can see that in the innovation in all the different types of tablets that we have now, from Kindle Fire to Surface tablets. In addition, apps are really a large part of media convergence because they allow you to get a lot of information very quickly and without a lot of storage on your devices. The App Store in 2020 says that there are 2 million apps on the Apple App Store. Google Play always seems to have a few more apps than Apple does. They have 2.96 million apps. And apps are a large part of the media industry. In January of this year, Apple Store actually reported its largest sales day ever on New Year's Day, $386 million in App Store sales, which was an increase of 20% from New Year's Day 2019. So you can see that this is big business for a lot of people, and convergence is just going to continue as these technologies merge and integrate with one another. The impact of convergence is that it really blurs the lines between different types of media. It changes the way that we interact with different media and technologies. For instance, while you're watching my videos, you might also be scrolling through Facebook or Instagram. And you may not know it, but a lot of these applications and apps are actually owned by very similar companies. So for instance, Instagram and its integration with Facebook and things like that. So what you're getting is a walled garden effect. Your textbook talks about this, where all operations are controlled by the operator, and you're really within this walled garden. If you think about like really tall hedges where you can't see outside of the garden, that's what the walled garden effect refers to. And when you're inside an app, all you really see is what's in that app. Everything you can do is controlled by that app creator and designer. And so that can happen both with apps as well as websites. And so it changes the way that we interact with the walled garden, because a lot of us are second screening while we're doing other things within our apps. There's also changing economics within the convergence. So we originally had Napster, which was one of the largest digital music providers. And then now iTunes has become that music provider for the current era. Amazon completely changed the way that books were delivered, where we had the traditional paperback books or hardback books that were sold in stores. Amazon created electronic books. They didn't create them, of course, but they made them more popularized for various people with the invention of the Kindle and other devices that were able to read ebooks a lot easier. Amazon also has Audible, which is their audiobook service. I love Audible personally and listen to it all the time, but it really changed the book industry, which we'll talk about in more detail in future weeks. In addition, these giants of media like Apple and Amazon are now producing new content with Apple TV Plus and Amazon Prime. We have lots of services that are now producing content and producing television and movies like the ones you see here. In fact, there have been some television shows that have actually been saved from cable, such as Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt or Gilmore Girls, which were originally canceled on broadcast television and kind of brought back to life through Netflix or other streaming services. So this has started to diversify some of the voices that are able to break into the entertainment industry, and it allows for new content to be generated. The impact of convergence can be seen through some of the numbers of the major players too. I like looking at Netflix's number because they are such a convergent media company. If you remember, Netflix actually started as a DVD mailing service where they would actually mail you the physical disc, and you could play either DVDs or Blu-rays, and then you would send them back. Now Netflix, of course, is known for its streaming, and Netflix says that it streams 100 million hours of programming on United States televisions every single day. And that number was taken well before COVID-19. So you can only imagine what those numbers are going to look like for 2020. Netflix users stream 164 hours of video every day, which equals about 18,000 years worth of streaming content. So every time it's hidden next episode for you, you're adding to that number. This accounts for 10% of all television viewing in the United States, which again just speaks to the power of Netflix's convergent media model. Another aspect of convergent media is the semantic web, and semantics is really the study of meaning. It's creating a meaningful, organized web experience, which there are lots of different ways that you can do this. This is by setting your preferences, or maybe you put plugins on your internet services. You know, there are many ways to organize the web for you. But the kind of interesting thing about semantic web that has been developing in recent years is that the web is starting to make connections for us. You can hear it when you're talking to your Alexa, or maybe you have Google Home or one of those services. They're starting to anticipate your needs through AI technology. For instance, my daughter, who is 5, loves to ask Alexa a joke every morning. And so now when we say, "Good morning, Alexa," she'll ask, "Skylar, do you want to hear a joke today?" without Skylar even having to ask. So Alexa is now anticipating her needs. In fact, Amazon just recently piloted something. They're starting to talk about anticipatory shipping, which means in their regional warehouses, they're starting to send things that they think you will order before you ever order them. based on your previous shopping habits, based on the needs from suppliers. They're going to anticipate what you're going to buy and be able to ship that from regional warehouses instead of national warehouses to cut down on delivery time. So these are some of the many ways that the web is being organized for us, and the meaning of our communication with the web is starting to connect for us rather than us connecting it for our own experience. Ownership is also important to consider in media convergence. Remember, there are two definitions of media convergence. The second is really who owns the media, and those ownerships really being very limited to some big key players. So who owns the internet? Who controls it? Well, if you'll remember back to the creation of the internet, when the Defense Department first created it, they did not want to have any ownership of the web. They didn't want to have an off switch for the net because it was a network. It was meant to help multiple people and institutions. And so there's no real ownership of the internet. And yet people try to control the internet through various means. And there's three primary control issues when talking about internet control and ownership. The first is the security of your personal information. So when you're putting your information into the web, who has it? Who gets to keep it? And who can see it once they have it? And so those are things that you can control by monitoring your privacy settings. And you can also control it by determining how you give out your information on the internet, which of course you need to be very careful in doing so. But in addition, organizations and legal experts are trying to figure out really who has ownership of that personal information, and that's still kind of being debated currently. There's also a debate about the appropriateness of online materials, particularly when it comes to children and materials, and how we can censor or limit some things on the internet, which we'll talk more about here in a second. The third is who can access the internet and to what degrees should the internet be open to all. And so this really, these three key issues are determined by the major leaders in control of the internet, and they happen to be the big five that you see here. The reason they're called the big five is because they own a majority of the technology, the assets, and the data that we use in our everyday lives. When you think about all the things that a single company like Apple or Google owns, and then now consider all the information that you give to these devices, they become very important players in who controls and owns your information and is able to have a voice in the restriction of internet and digital media access. And so it's important to be thinking about these owners because they have a key stake in these conversations that we'll talk a little bit about later. One of the primary things that we can do to protect our information is through online safety. This is part of digital media literacy, is knowing how to keep your information private and safe. And I'll be honest, there is no such thing as true privacy on the web. I always like to tell my students that the internet is written in ink and not pencil, because even if you go back and delete a post in social media, it's very likely that someone will be able to find the information that you post on the web years and years afterwards. So you have to be very careful about what you put on the internet and on your social media channels. This is done primarily through data mining, which is the gathering of data and information by various organizations. Data mining may sound scary, but it can actually be used for great good too. And so there has to be a key balance in how much information you give and how much information organizations should be able to gather on individuals. In addition, there are cookies, which are used to create marketing profiles for advertising. If you've ever searched, comfortable shoes, for instance, and never purchased an actual item, you'll notice that your advertisements on various platforms will now show you all different kinds of comfortable shoe brands. And this is because of the cookies that are created when you search things on the internet. It's generating marketing profiles that can be used for targeted advertising in the future. So make sure you're going through and clearing out your cookies regularly so that you're not amassing great amounts of data that can be used against you. Spyware is info gathering software that's usually hidden in downloads. So it's important that when you are downloading things from the internet that you're doing so from reliable companies and sources, and that you are using technology and other programs that would prevent spyware from entering your computer. Also, pop-up blockers help prevent the spyware as well. Opt-in and opt-out policies are usually driven by the organization. Opt-in policies mean that you are opting in to sharing your information, and it requires you to actually say, yes, I want to give you my information. Where an opt-out policy requires you to go into your account, usually online through an organization, and actually click, I don't want my information to be shared here. And while it may seem like a very small difference, choosing to, yes, share my information, or no, I don't want my information there, it's actually a key part of privacy, because consumers and privacy advocates really want to have to be willing to give their information rather than have to take the effort to go and say, no, you can't have it. Where, of course, organizations and for-profit companies really want an opt-out policy because they want as much information as possible. And they know that most people are not going to take the time to opt out of sharing their information. Finally, you need to be aware of what's called phishing, but it is spelled with a PH. I didn't make a misspelling here. Phishing in digital technology is when someone sends you a phony email, link. This has even been done through text, and it asks for personal information. And when you click the link, you can either get a virus on your computer, or it's going to ask you to enter some personal information, and it's not really the person who they say they are. So make sure, especially with organizational emails like your Montevallo email, that you never click on links unless it comes from a montevallo.edu address, and that you know who you're giving your information to. It's always important in personal privacy protection. We also need to talk about the appropriateness of content on the web. After 9/11, the United States passed the Patriot Act, which grants law enforcement the power to intercept online communication, both emails and browsing history. This was done primarily to prevent terrorism. And so you need to know that the government does have the ability to look at your email and browsing history with cause. In addition, the government and federal funded libraries and schools have the ability to filter content for appropriate under the Children's Internet Protection Act. The filters have to be done manually through schools and libraries, but they are meant to block obscene, pornographic, or harmful to minors material. And so therefore, those sites are filtered if the organization is receiving federal funds. But what about sites that are dangerous for public safety? For instance, this gentleman is known for publishing printouts, patterns for 3D printed guns. And some people say that he has a right to do this because of the First Amendment and free speech. And yet other people say that it's a violation of public safety and gun control, because when you print a gun using a 3D pattern, it will not have a serial number. It does not have to be registered. And while it is very expensive and not very likely to be used for, an everyday public individual, it can help you circumvent gun laws and gun regulation. So to what degree should we allow content like this to be posted online. And this is something that the courts and our government are still deciding, and something that you should be considering as well. In addition, the American Academy of Pediatrics is very concerned about the amount of screen time that young individuals are receiving, especially in convergent media era, where, you know, my 5-year-old knows how to get on my cell phone and take pictures on Snapchat. But with screen time, there are some very dangerous physical and mental effects of having too much screen time. So the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests that parents limit the time that children have device screen time. And yet we all know that in this era of COVID, we're having to do remote learning, which requires you to be on screens. You know, all of our technology can be educational, but it can also be harmful according to these experts. And so we need to kind of be thinking about, where do those limits lie and who should be setting them? While internet addiction is fairly rare, it is something that we need to consider. The rates have actually been rising pretty steadily recently, and the variables that tend to lead to addiction are being male and very young. So a lot of you fall in the category of the age group, and having early exposure to the internet at a frequent pace. And so as the younger generations are starting to use internet more and more at a young age, and other digital devices at a young age, it's important that we consider internet addiction as something that could possibly be rising in the future. Finally, we come to the third point of media ownership, which is digital access. The digital divide is a concept that talks about the have and have-nots, and there are really two pieces of the digital divide. The first is economics, which means that you have enough money to have a computer or smart device that can connect to the internet. And second is being able to have access to the internet, either being able to pay for it or having a company that provides internet access to your location. Research has shown that race, age, and education all impact access, and 73% of Americans have access at home, but minorities, older adults, and rural residents are less likely to have this internet connection, which increases the digital divide. 17% of the American population are smartphone-only internet users. These are primarily younger adults, non-whites, and lower income families. And the reason this is important is because smartphones have been shown to close the gap in the digital divide. Typically, a smartphone is a lot cheaper than buying a PC or laptop, or some versions of smartphones, of course. And there are government assistance programs that provide smartphones for some families at lower income levels. And so this could be a potential way that we close the digital divide, but it's still an issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm sure many of you, being in rural areas, know that even if you have internet access, it may not be reliable to do everything that the technological demands of remote learning or other internet access needs have. While these are the numbers for the American digital divide, which are somewhat closing at a pretty good rate as of recent, we also have to consider the global digital divide. For instance, I just finished a research project where I worked with South Vietnamese rural populations. They took a survey to see how many of them were accessing the internet, and those who were accessing the internet, how many of them used it for healthcare information. And unfortunately, in rural Vietnam, the digital divide is extremely wide. And it is still based on these similar categories where older adults, rural residents, and a lack of education all increase the digital divide. And so it's important to be considering global programs that could educate and close that gap. Finally, net neutrality is the idea that every web user has the right to the same internet network speed as well as access to it. There is a great fear by many people that companies will try to make more money, increase prices for internet access, and make internet less equal. For instance, if you have certain providers, they may slow down your internet speed based on how much you pay. And this makes it so that the digital divide widens, because if you don't have the same speed, it could be that you are losing some access to content on the internet. There are many companies within the major players of media who are in favor of net neutrality, this equal access, like Google, Yahoo, Amazon, Facebook, and Skype. But a lot of the service providers like Time Warner Cable, Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon are not. And it doesn't take, someone who really studies this area to think why. It's because these are the companies that make money based on your ability to connect to the internet, while someone like Google doesn't necessarily make money from you paying your internet bill. The problem is that these four companies control 98% of all broadband connection. So if net neutrality does not pass and is not enforced within our country, what could happen is they could increase the prices to a point where fewer Americans can afford equal internet access, and therefore our digital divide will continue to widen, and there will be unfair access issues within our country. So one place that you can make a difference if you have strong opinions about net neutrality is Save the Internet, and they actually have some advocacy about net neutrality, as well as information if you're interested in learning more about this concept. So you have finished the videos for week 2 for MC100. Congratulations. Next up, you need to do your discussion post about the digital divide, and then read chapter 3 for next week's material. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the internet. Of course, there's so much more that we could talk about, but within the survey course, this is all that we cover. However, if you're interested in learning more about digital communication, please reach out. I have a lot of various resources that I can share with you. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.